707 on CJED. Welcome to today's Entrepreneur, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. My name is Dan Delmar, along with Fuller Landau's Mike Newton, who is filling in for Josh Miller tonight. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Dan. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
So Josh is, of course, on his annual trip to Hong Kong, exploring opportunities there. I actually just texted him, so hopefully he's going to send us some thoughts from Hong Kong about developing more business out there. So we'll wait to hear from him.
Given the 13-hour time difference, he's probably waking up, but he's probably had about 2 hours worth of sleep at this point, so I'm not sure his text will be terribly coherent.
All right, and our guest this evening on today's Entrepreneur is Jamie Benizri of Legal Logik. Welcome, Jamie.
Good to have. Hey, thanks for having me tonight.
Thanks for coming in. So first, we start, Mike, by just maybe talking about a bit about what you do, Jamie. Tell us about Legal Logik.
Well, Legal Logik is really a fully comprehensive law firm that started off with its roots in business. It really started off with, offering its services to the entrepreneurial community, and has since branched off to do more, litigation, and really broaden its service offerings to its entrepreneur base.
Yeah, I think, Jamie, when you and I were talking earlier, I think one of the things that I find rather intriguing is trying to take what has been traditional roles, and clearly no different than our profession as well, and try and make it something that commoditizes some of the services, as well as trying to branch off in certain areas that create, some value at the end of the day. And I think later in the program we're going to get into this whole discussion of professional firms and the ultimate ability to transition your firm or sell your own firm. We spend all our time with our clients, and many times most of us forget that we actually run our own businesses as well.
Do you find that's a difficult balance to have, Jamie, to sort of manage the clients and be a business person at the same time?
Well, traditionally lawyers aren't known to be entrepreneurial, so to branch out and think out of the box sometimes is not easy. Typically what we've tried to do is really kind of marry the two and bring a lot of our services, like was brought up earlier, the commoditization of certain services, to really, give entrepreneurs access to services that wouldn't otherwise be available to them, to really, good legal advice, and really allow them to grow with a professional firm.
Jim, why don't you give us a little bit of history of where you came from? Certainly come a long way, I think, from where you started practicing and some of the work you were doing, I think you said, for City of Montreal. So maybe give us a little bit of history on that and why you ended up going from that field into the entrepreneurial side of things.
Well, my like you mentioned, my roots really stemmed in a small boutique firm, which was really giving me the opportunity to really strengthen and sharpen a lot of my legal skills, both from a litigation perspective and from a business perspective. So I had good foundation in corporate law and commercial law, as well as the litigation components of what this practice was all about. So when I had transitioned my career, really the approach was to make it an entrepreneurial venture, with entrepreneurs in mind, and really kind of make packages for them, and really be able to cater to their needs and grow with their needs. And as was mentioned, it started off as a business boutique firm, but it then kind of became, we added components like litigation. We added components that allowed them to kind of, stay within one firm in order to meet all their needs.
I'm surprised a similar service doesn't exist already. How did you carve out this market, and how did you see the need for this type of really specialized, customized service?
Well, I think that, in my experience, there was a lot of, I keep going back to commoditization, but I found a need for entrepreneurs to have a service that they would be able to access. And there was already an online alternative to conventional law firms opening businesses and charging X amount of dollars. So we already saw this online model. So instead of competing in that online model, we said, look, our value-added approach is not at the incorporation level, but really at the service level and over time, in order to have entrepreneurs come in, take advantage of the service, and for us to grow with them. So it was really all about saying, how do we differentiate ourselves in the market, and how do we not compete on price?
Well, if you take this commoditization, or the products that we're talking about, can you maybe just give the audience a quick run through in terms of you going from incorporation? I mean, for most people, that sounds like a word that is relatively simple, but could be rather daunting when it comes time to actually incorporate a company. You're taking it out of the realm of being kind of feared into turning it into some kind of basic process.
We've chosen incorporations really as the foundation of the building blocks of legal logic. What we've basically done is taken that service. We've taken a process that has been commoditized and is recognized as being commoditized in the service, and we are incorporating companies with no legal fees. So basically the client is only paying for the costs to incorporate and the hardware to physically incorporate them. And with the value proposal is that we will be tending to this company, making sure that it's in compliant with laws over a certain fixed period of time.
It sounds very philanthropic up front. Obviously, you're in it to make some money. So how does the actual business model?
So the only way, like you said, it's a for-profit company. It's a for-profit firm, just to be upfront. So obviously, the only way that we're able to recoup the investment is obviously through annual fees that will be charged to maintain this company, which needs to be done on an annual basis in any event. The fees are extremely fair and competitive, and it encompasses basically any resolution that a company needs over its corporate year. And obviously, the idea is to service their other needs, from litigation to fill in the blank.
So take a step back to litigation. I mean, you came from that environment. Litigation is probably about as scary as any entrepreneur is actually going to face when it comes to the world that they live in. You worked kind of, I guess, as a prosecutor initially, which pretty much puts you on the blacklist from day one. Explain how what you used to do, and I guess how you moved forward, and what you learned at that level in order to take forward for your entrepreneurs.
It's true that litigation is kind of something that no one really thinks about, especially when they go into business. People go into business rosy-eyed, but my background, as you had mentioned, does have foundations in litigation. I was a prosecutor for the city of Montreal. So we were doing high volume litigation, and it really, for me, it was almost an essential cornerstone in the foundation of me learning the legal process and applying that to how entrepreneurs can kind of avoid going into that kind of into those venues.
So you can you know the pitfalls, the areas where a lot of clients traditionally will fall down, and I guess part of the service that you're rendering is the ability to try and keep them from tripping over themselves.
I think the something that my clients most benefit from is the fact that I do have litigation experience, and I from a business perspective, I do try to preemptively address those litigation concerns.
Jamie Benezri, our guest on today's Entrepreneur. He's from Legal Logik.
14694-2945. Cuisine West Island, for those not easily impressed.
Professional advice with a personal touch. Consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Inspiring stories from outstanding business people. Dan Delmar, along with Fuller Landau's Mike Newton, in for Josh Miller, who's in Hong Kong. And Mike, our guest, is Jamie Benezri of Legal Logik, talking about a different sort of legal service.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think, part of one of the things we have to go through in the discussion, I guess, is from the entrepreneurial perspective, is how do you protect yourself? And a lot of the discussion with Jamie before circled around prevention and setting people up properly, things to watch for. I think some of his history helps in avoiding some of those pitfalls. There's certainly some of the other things that he does that are a little more creative and a little more outside the box. But let's go back to get rid of some of the bare bones basic discussions when you're talking about an entrepreneur needing to protect his assets or her assets. A client comes to you and says, I got this great idea. I'm going to sink in $5 or $500,000. Where do you steer them? What are some of the questions to kind of funnel them down?
Well, there is, we talked a little bit before about, offering a service that's kind of open to the public, and it's accessible and it's free. And these are all kind of words and notions that lawyers traditionally do not encompass in their regular practice. But what we do is we really try to kind of bring those services and tailor them to individual needs. So in a case that you describe, someone is bringing an investment in capital or an investment in intellectual property. For me, it's paramount to know where they're going with it. Which jurisdictions do they want to exploit it in? Where the product will be sold. So these are all considerations that I need to know in order to steer them to see, first of all, are they in the right jurisdiction? Am I the right man for it? And we're very fortunate to have a large network of people, both domestic, extra-provincial, international, that we can rely on to kind of steer them in the right direction.
I think a lot of people don't realize when they set up shop that they can incorporate here in Quebec, or they can incorporate at the federal level. But every time they do business in the U.S. or they do business in Europe, I mean, they're exposing themselves to potential risk, potential liability. You're signing a contract with somebody outside of the Canadian borders. Who governs the rules? How do you set them up? How do you steer them in the right direction?
Well, a lot of people have the misconception that they need to incorporate. They need to have a corporation. Otherwise, it's kind of the only way to do business. But, in fact, there are various ways to do business. You can do business under your own name. You can do business under a federal charter, which will be governed by Canada. You can do business under the rules of Quebec. So there, from my perspective, it's important to know, first of all, what the budget is, what the immediate needs of the business person is, because the reality is you can sign, Jamie Benizri personally, or Dan Delmar personally can sign a contract with, I'll just say it's Ferrari based out of Italy, or Dan Delmar Incorporated can do so as well, which is going to be a corporate entity. So in terms of who can do business, and if you have to stay within your borders of, we'll say, Beaconsfield or Dollard, it's not true. You can contractually bind yourself with anyone.
Okay. One of the services you were talking about before, I think what a lot of legal firms do is collections on behalf of some of your clients when they hit an area that, as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years with the economy and not being in the greatest shape, we're seeing a lot of people, I think, in the last 12 to 18 months having problem collecting on some of their receivables. Obviously, there's part of that is a service that you render for your clients locally. But what happens if an individual also is outside of their jurisdiction? How do you help a client to deal with a contract in the U.S. where he needs to collect? How do you protect them?
Well, first of all, my bar is only in Quebec, so unfortunately, I can't go into New York and start litigating in New York. So we do have partnerships. We set up partnerships with people kind of in the New England areas, in Ontario, and in kind of other jurisdictions that kind of typically we deal with. So for clients that are outside, obviously we can interpret a contract. The language is universal. Lawyers have created this alternative kind of language to kind of, not to exclude other people, but it's because this is what the courts are accustomed to. So it's usually, whether it's common law or civil law, the language is consistent. Mm-hmm. So I am able to act, in an Ontario, we'll say merger, or an Ontario transaction, or not litigation, but I'm able to act in that capacity and maybe look at one aspect of it, and maybe pass that off to counsel in Ontario or New York, when it kind of falls outside of my jurisdiction.
Okay, and when it falls outside of that contractual law and somebody just needs a little bit of help getting some collection, you provide that service as well.
Yeah, within the jurisdiction of Quebec, 100%.
And how do you price that, or how would you work that?
Well, one of the services that we've tried to do is, we were finding needs, and we were really sensitive to clients who would come in, and I'll shoot at a number of $15,000 claim that they have been unable to collect for we'll say a year and a half. And the first fear when you go to an attorney's office is the fact that, well, look, is this claim going to cost me $25,000? So in order to address those needs and to try to relativize the legal services, almost like a credit agency would, we've set up a form of percentage-based model with an administrative component model in order to take out those fears and to make it more approachable. Perfect. And make it easier to budget at the end of the day.
Hold that thought. I'll just leave you with one thought. One of my partners once told me when we were trying to collect a receivable, he said, remember that $5 and principal will get you coffee and maybe not more. So some days you got to remember that you can't just fight somebody because they upset you. It's obviously it has to have some kind of valid financial model to it.
I have clients that'll probably argue that, but
yes, I know.
Today's Entrepreneur on CJD with our guest Jamie Benizri of Legal Logik. Jamie Benizri, our guest from Legal Logik on today's Entrepreneur, and Mike Newton here with me filling in for Josh Miller, who's in Hong Kong. Hey, and Legal Logik, there's spin-offs to Legal Logik too, right? It's not just the legal business.
100%. I think that one of the things Jamie's trying to create is something bigger than Jamie, ultimately at the end of the day. And I think that, you're 10 to 12 people, as you were explaining to me earlier, in a number of different branches. And maybe take a couple of minutes, Jamie, just kind of give us an idea of where the people are. What are some of the services that you're offering that make this more than just coming to see Jamie?
So this is, like I said, I mean, this isn't about Jamie. This isn't about, Benizri and Associates. This isn't about Jamie and Associates. What I've tried to do is bring this online model, and Legal Logic is, the logo is a little different. There's a K in the name. There's a couple things that kind of make it seem like maybe a non-traditional law firm. We've kind of branched out, and through my experience and experience with a partner of mine, Avi Levy, we've created an alternative brand. And this comes really from my history as a prosecutor at the City of Montreal. We've created a brand called TicketAid, which addresses people's ticket needs on and off the island of Montreal.
When you talk ticket, you're talking traffic tickets?
We're talking traffic tickets. We're talking stop signs. We're talking, and we're not talking about, parking tickets, but this is really a demerit points play. And the beauty of the product is that, we've actually managed to find a way to guarantee the service and really give back people 50% of their money if we're unsuccessful in reducing their demerit points. So then again, is another thing that we're trying to use to really distinct ourselves and set ourselves apart, from the competition, to say, look, we are results driven, and this is what we are going to do. So, we really put our money where our mouth is.
So when you talk about breaking down the points and dropping the demerit points from certain levels, I mean, how successful is this? Some people feel it's a waste of time. Other people find themselves in trouble, never-ending trouble. How do you play out on some of these issues?
You know what? It's really on a case-by-case basis. I think that our success rate, for me, is extremely high, because if we find that there is no settlement possible, there's always a way to help the client. I mean, it's not to obstruct justice and reduce points at any cost. It's really to find the best suitable solution under the circumstance, if that's by reducing points or costs, or helping the person manage their demerit points. There's more than just one way to help a driver out, keeping a driver behind the wheel. So there's really, it's multifaceted. Every case is different, and we treat it, we treat every case, professionally and diligently.
So what you're telling me is the next time I end up with a few demerit points and I realize I've done wrong and I know I should slap myself on the wrist, before I just pay that ticket and fess up, I should give you a call.
I would log on ticketaid.ca. That's what
okay, perfect. Thank you.
Today's entrepreneur with our guest Jamie Benizri of Legal Logic, and there's more to Jamie. There's TX Logic, a lot of different spin-offs of this business. So we're going to get to that after the break and talk more about the kind of stuff that Jamie does. And also later on, Mike, we're going to talk about family businesses in terms of succession and how to plan for the future. And it's never too early to start, and we'll get to that in a little bit later as well.
Definitely, and I think the play after the break with Jamie, it fits in nicely. It's a discussion of M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and how to sell your business, or if you want to buy a business, which obviously leads right into that whole discussion of, what do we do with our family business at some point.
All right, 7:34 on CJAD. Today's Entrepreneur, presented by Fuller Landau, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. Dan Delmar, along with Fuller Landau's Mike Newton, who's in for Josh Miller, who is himself in Hong Kong this week, his annual trip to Hong Kong. So Josh will be back next week. And Mike, our guest this evening, is Jamie Benizri of Legal Logic. And Jamie is a very interesting entrepreneur because he has sort of a lot going on in that scope of businesses. Not just a lawyer, but there's more.
There is, and I think one of the things that I find fascinating is the ability to try and get outside of the professional service, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not about promoting Jamie, but more about promoting different services, different features that kind of stand on their own at the end of the day. I mean, we all know that you are the key man, and we all know that you're the big player, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there's got to be some life that continues on, especially since you've got a 2-year-old child, and you have to spend a little bit of time at home from time to time. I think today's entrepreneurs, there's this constant battle between life, work-life balance, which is a term that I really don't like because it comes across meaning I really want to spend Friday afternoon with the barbecue as opposed to doing any kind of work. But I think one of the things that you're doing, this TX Logic, I think it is fascinating because I think it's providing a venue that most people are unaware of that really is something that should be done, and that really is kind of creating a mergers and acquisition. Let's call it bulletin board, if you will, or a matching service. So maybe give us a little bit of a lowdown on that.
So, I mean, just to go back a little bit, you mentioned big player, and the idea really is not to highlight me or highlight any one particular person, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't people behind me, running the engine, so to speak. So, I'm fortunate that we do have a nice sized staff. We do have people who are kind of helping turn the wheel, so to speak. There's 2 other lawyers in our office, Aram and Jeff. And there's Amanda, and there's a ton of people who really help us provide the service. So, and obviously my wife who's obviously
Basically puts up with you.
Who tolerates me.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, we have done that. Legal Logic has served almost as a template to be used in different venues. And you talked about our business matchmaking service. And that's something that we did through a website that is called TX Logic. TX Logic really is a site, in its purest sense, is a business brokerage business site. And the idea of this is really to have a comprehensive model that incorporates business brokers, lawyers, accountants. And it's really a venue for someone who's buying a business to benefit from this comprehensive service instead of going around and shopping and collecting all of these groups of individuals.
So what you're trying to say is you're trying to put me out of business by providing the one-stop shop on some of these deals.
You've got about 3 years left. Yeah.
Okay, good, thanks. Perfect.
So where did you see the need for this? How did this come about?
You know what? I was discussing with and my partner in that is his name is Dominic Gipos, and he comes from the banking sector. He's sales driven, and the impetus, I guess, for this was almost not selfish, but it was almost to be a sales generator. And really, for me, that's really what it started off becoming, and it's evolved into something much more. And it's really there's a niche for this, because if you think right now, if I gave you 20 seconds and I asked you to tell me, who's the quintessential business brokerage services, not many brands come to mind. So that's really what we're trying to carve ourselves out of, is to say, look, this is the place where you go to buy a small to medium-sized business where there's no headaches.
Do you say by buying in bulk, so to speak?
Look, like I said, I like to go back to tailored. Like we said, I've used commoditized, I've used standardized, but it's really, we're using that model. But at the end of the day, everything really is tailored to specific needs, but we benefit from standardized processes. And in this way, we are able to pass off economies of scale and other kinds of savings to clients.
So your pricing model is not one of an hourly service. Your pricing model in terms of the support on a due diligence or a posting or a matchmaking is done on a commission basis or percentage basis?
For TX Logic, it'll be strictly on a commission basis unless the client opts for otherwise. Sometimes it's impossible to opt away from the hourly business model, because at the end of the day, if it's something that if I'm forcing you to sell me something or to sell my client something, you can't quantify that. I'm forcing you. I'm preventing you from doing something. It's some things in law cannot be quantified, and therefore the hourly business model will never die for that purpose. But for business purposes and entrepreneurs' day-to-day needs, we have found a way to eliminate fees from the beginning and really fix fees in order to give entrepreneurs access to solid legal advice.
So what you're trying to do basically is cut down on the risk associated to an individual of running through the process of selling their business and not being able to get there necessarily, to find out at the end of the day they've got a professional fee of X dollars at the end of the day, whereas this is tied into the actual sale. If I go to the website, and I'll give you a quick plug, txlogic.com, you have a list of some of the businesses that have been sold, and you're anywhere from, I'm looking at the quick range of $119,000 to almost $1.6 million. So it's a pretty wide range as well. I mean, you have bakeries, catering, wholesalers, deponers and gas stations. So a little bit, is that the size of business? Are you looking at the more mom and pop type environment that doesn't have that depth of a professional group behind them?
You know what? It's a little bit of both. I think we're looking for professionals who are business owners that don't necessarily want to engage services without knowing that there's a buyer at the end of the day. And we're looking for mom and pops, and we're really, like you said, it's really a matchmaking service. And we are willing to offer our service, and obviously our commission, it will be ultimately based on the size of the business and the value of the business, and that all that is determined by the business brokerage, the in-house business brokers. But yes, I think we're small to medium size. I would say anywhere from, like you said, $116,000 to $5-10 million businesses will be in our price range and will fit nicely into our standardized processes.
So, let's talk a little bit about the standardized processes. Let's talk about the due diligence process. Let's talk about some of the contracts. Please. Let's talk about the letters of intent. I mean, a lot of things that people hear or read about that really have no idea of what that involves. Maybe walk us through. I walk in and I say to you, Jamie, I've got a business. I've had the business for 10 years. Of course, I think it's worth 10 times more than it is because I'm the entrepreneur, and of course, it's worth more. How do I move forward? What do I do? What do I say to you? Where do I go? What information are you looking for from me? And I mean, am I coming in at the last minute, or am I coming into you and saying, Jamie, I want to sell this in a year?
You know what? There's always the emotional aspect, whether it's, it's litigation, whether it's business. There's always an emotional component to, anything that I've done and anything that lawyers do. So there's always, like you said, you have to manage expectations a lot of the times. And at the end of the day, why are people so scared of engaging professional services for their business? Why aren't people as scared when they sell their home? The value is sometimes more than the business. But it's almost more acceptable to transact on your home and engage a professional service based on commission than it is to sell your business. There's a lot more emotion involved sometimes, but not always. You raise your families there, and the emotions are really the same. So I think at the end of the day, my job is really to assess from an objective perspective what the business can get, and then really at that point maximize the value of it.
Does that make the, and I'll use the term, the ma and pa shops a little bit easier under the model, as they are a little more, I don't want to call them standardized, but they're a little bit easier to package at the end of the day than, say, a manufacturing company or an import distribution company that's been around for years. I would assume that the shell or the technique that you're using certainly plays better to something that's a little more standardized.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's more debtors are transacted.
Because clearly I'm trying to find a way to revive my services at the end of the day. So you go ahead and I'll let you talk for a while.
Like I said, I mean, you have 3 years, so you still got time. But at the end of the day, I think that it would be hard for me to sell. I mean, I wouldn't say hard, but it is harder for me to sell manufacturers. Someone that manufactures, I don't know, on-air buttons. I mean, there's only so big of a market for it. Debtors, people transact on a regular basis, just as they do homes. So, right, it's really, how do I base the values of this? Well, it's really based on market research, and a lot of it is going to be based on, from an emotional perspective, what is this person really willing to let it go for? And that's, I'm sure, something that you come across on a regular basis. Yeah. Like you said, people want to value it at 10 times, but they can't get more than 3 times. Where am I going with it? And at the same time, it's not fair for me to have a listing on the market for 2 years, because it doesn't, represent the list, our listings properly. So again, you have to be able to manage expectations, and I think a lot of that is done through objective information, through compiling market research, and having the professionals on board to say, look, buddy, you better tone it down because no one's going to buy your debtor for $8.9 million.
When you look at it from a legal due diligence perspective, what are some of the things you're looking at when you're going to help somebody on a legal due diligence side?
Legal due diligence is one of something that cannot be overlooked. It's essential, and a lot of times people want to skimp out and maybe not pay for due diligence, or maybe have their lawyer compile the information and then pass off the information to the client for them to read. It is so primordial, and it's we believe so much in it, and that really comes into the preventive philosophies of a litigator, is to say, well, for me, the due diligence is really a report card to say, look, these are the potential pitfalls, and this is the way that we are going to, address some of the issues that we've discovered during due diligence.
Jamie Binizri, our guest on today's Entrepreneur from Legal Logik, and Jamie's one piece of advice for today's entrepreneurs coming up before 8 o'clock. But first, after the break, we're going to talk about, Mike, family businesses and succession and transition. And if you have a question for Mike on that, shoot us off a quick text message to 514-800. So how to prepare, lay the groundwork for future generations of your business, that is next. Inspiring stories from outstanding business people, Dan Delmar and Fuller Landau's Mike Newton in for Josh Miller this week. Jamie Benizri is here from Legal Logik. We'll hear his piece of advice for today's entrepreneur in just a moment. But first, Mike, we want to talk about family businesses and particularly the issue of transition and succession. If you have other generations in the business and you're thinking maybe one day they may want to inherit that business or participate in it, how to go about that. When is there such a thing as too early to prepare for transition? Do you want to do this when your kids are, when you have kids? I mean, when they're 10, 12, 18, at what point do you say, I should start thinking about this?
Well, I think it all depends on the individual. It depends on the entrepreneur. It depends on the family. It's there's no perfect time. I mean, you'll look at some family businesses, and from the time the kids start to walk, they've groomed them as the next CEO of the family business. What they do seem to forget at some point is maybe the kids don't want it or don't have the skills. And I think that's the matching reality to expectation, I think, is probably the hardest thing that most of the entrepreneurs in a family business are ever going to face. And accepting the fact that, little Johnny or little Sarah maybe isn't the best person to take over this business. And, they use a very harsh term, which is called pruning the family tree. Which unfortunately comes to mind when an individual does not live up to the expectation or the capacity. And I think that's a hard part. I mean, as far as planning in advance, you can never start to plan too soon. The reality of living in the world where tomorrow's leader needs a year, 10 years, 20 years, exists. Again, depends on the individual. There's a kind of few rules of thumb. If you give me my first choice, I'd love to see that graduating university graduate go work somewhere else for 2 or 3 years before he joins the family business, even though he may have worked as a shipper, he may have worked in a clerical job while he was going through school. Let him cut his teeth somewhere else, and let him come back to the business with some credibility. Mm-hmm. He's not just showing up one day as daddy's son or mummy's son. He's actually coming in with some kind of past history too.
There's a couple of entrepreneurs who we've profiled on the show who have advised their children to do just that, to make their mistakes somewhere else, get experience, and then come to the family business.
Well, part of it's making their mistakes. Part of it is, like I said, is credibility, that they've actually had a job somewhere else other than mommy and daddy have provided for them. And in some cases, it's also about learning respect and learning that, when mom and dad come down hard on you, it's not just because you're their son. Maybe you just didn't do the right job. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to ever separate is, you sit in the boardroom, you sit in the halls, you sit in the shipping department 5-6 days a week, and then Sunday evening you all get together and sit around the table for dinner and have to try and forget that one of you made a mistake this week. And that's probably the hardest part. And I think one of the biggest issues we see with a lot of companies, a lot of family businesses, is this lack of formality. One of the things family businesses pride themselves on is the ability to have the family involved and run it like a family. It's very difficult at the end of the day when it comes time to sell it, to turn around and take a business where we've all kind of been, I don't want to say loosey-goosey, but maybe not the corporate environment, when an individual's coming in and doesn't have that emotional attachment, who wants to see. And in many cases, people do not get the maximum value for their businesses because they really don't have that depth and succession within the business. Forget at the ownership level, just at various positions along the way.
Jamie, you have a 2-year-old. Is it too early to start thinking about succession?
You know what? I've already I bought him a gown so he can wear, and I bought him a wig.
Perfect.
So he wears it around the house, and I'm proud of him. But at the end of the day, it's quite common that most lawyers don't want their children to follow in their footsteps, and there's obviously a lot more barriers in law. A lot of children don't make it, don't have the capacity to make it through law school. So, I think there's a lot more barriers to entry in the family business. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a question of never being too ready. And I think, to be honest, I'm at the beginning of my career. I'm witnessing the growth of a lot of businesses, and hopefully the show will be around in about 30 years, so I can see the transition of all the people that I'm starting now, and hopefully have set them up, structure them properly in order to kind of pass on the reins. So I think, like you said, it best. It's really a mindset. I want little Johnny and little Sarah to be in a position where the parents have made good legal, sound legal and accounting decisions for them to fit into maybe a more formal structure. So I don't want to make it too rigid, but at the same token, I think you said it well and said loosey goosey. Sometimes it's advantageous to kind of instill a little discipline.
And Mike, it is a bit trickier, right, when you're talking about professional services to sort of fit into that a more rigid mold as opposed to, say, the family restaurant.
100%. I think one of the big problems we have as professionals is we're so caught up in our own egos of how self-important we are that we don't find ourselves in an environment that lends itself very well to continuing on, tomorrow if I'm not here. And it's one of the things I think that drew me to the initial discussion with Jamie is the ability to try and commoditize certain things, to try and take him out of the equation so that there is a saleable entity somewhere down the line, which unfortunately has caused the downfall of many a professional firm, that once you get past the first founding layers, maybe you'll get through a second. It's hard to get to the third, and boy, that doesn't really sound much different than any other family business, does it?
Real quick, for those entrepreneurs listening who may have children in the business, they've done nothing so far, no paperwork, no transition planning. What's your advice for them to at least get the groundwork started?
Well, I think you have to start formalizing things between either agreements, the will, some kind of corporate environment. I mean, if you want to sell their business, and if little Johnny and little Sarah are not going to take over and need a third party to sell, you got to start setting the groundwork 5 years in advance. I mean, you can't all of a sudden wake up one day and say, you know what, I don't feel like going to the office, let's sell, and get anywhere close to maximizing the value for your business.
Today's Entrepreneur on CJAD coming up. Jamie Benizri of Legal Logik shares his one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur. 7:56 on today's Entrepreneur, and our guest, Jamie Benizri of Legal Logik, and Mike Newton in for Josh Miller, by the way, who's back next Monday night at 7 on today's Entrepreneur. Now, we end the program usually with talking about the one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur. And Jamie, what is your message for entrepreneurs out there listening tonight?
You're really putting me on the spot here, because there's so many facets of advice. But at the end of the day, I think it's really to be happy in what you do in your daily functions. Whether it's you fit in in a marketing role, whether you fit in as a professional. People go into professions sometimes for. And I'm speaking from experience. Sometimes people go into professions because it's the only thing they can think of to do at that time. But at the end of the day, if you don't pick up the momentum of passion, if you don't pick up the momentum of having that burning desire to actually service clients, I think at the end of the day, you're in the wrong profession. Because like you had mentioned earlier, separation of work-life balance is an extremely difficult thing to achieve, especially in professions. So I think that it's really to make sure you love what you do, because you're going to be doing it for a long time, and if you have that entrepreneurial spirit, you better act on it, because like you said earlier, there's no right time. There's no right time for succession planning. So like I said, I think, maybe, in convincing myself, my message is, there really is no right time. So you got to act on your instincts.
Perfect. I think been doing this now for 23, 24 years, and I think the keys to success, and whether it's a professional firm, whether it's an importer, whether it's a manufacturer, whether it's a successful anything, passion and execution. I think the ability to get things done. I think I've watched more family businesses particularly fail because of a lack of execution. Excuse me. And I think clearly the lack of passion that the next generations is hard to create. Mom and dad created this, their heart and soul. It's like their children all over again. Next generation doesn't come in quite as passionate. Without that ability to get things done, you're up for an uphill battle.
And one lesson I learned from tonight is don't be afraid to reinvent the wheel. And in Jamie's case, he took a service, a profession which is normally quite rigid, and sort of thought outside the box. And that, I think, is an interesting lesson as well.
Appreciate that.
Very much so.
So thanks again, Jamie Benizri of Legal Logik, of TX Logic. Did I leave anything out, by the way?
You forgot TicketAid.
TicketAid, yeah. Anything else?
I don't even remember.
No?
He's got so many things going. He's got to remember. Lucky he's got a good group behind him.
I'll be here for about a month, I think. Right? I'm filling in.
Thanks very much, Jamie Benizri, and thanks, Mike Newton. Josh Miller is back next Monday night.
Thank you, Dan. Hopefully I've been a formidable replacement for Mr. Miller, who's got that big, booming radio voice.
You're just great. And don't forget, you can reach Fuller Landau during business hours at 514-875-2865 or visit www.flmontreal.com. This is Montreal's News Talk leader, CJAD 800.